Can everybody see that activity analysis sheet?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so today's activity analysis presentation, so probably half an hour or so, just discussion as to how we use activity analysis, and I'd put together this agenda of, okay, where does it come from? Ricardo used the phrase time and motion study, and there's a question there of what that looks like and how we would understand what time and motion is. I think we've then got a piece on 5 challenges that we would see with any activity analysis study. So things to be aware of, but also certain challenges that you might not overcome with activity analysis. So it's a question of just being aware of them as we go through. There's a couple of different approaches we've used. So spreadsheets and the use of an app. So a couple of descriptions or discussions about how that looks. And then, from my point of view, it'd be very useful to understand your experiences. If there's anything that we've said here, he goes, actually, those challenges, the three of which you mentioned, totally resonated. One we've never seen before, and actually you've totally missed out X, Y, and Z. That would be really useful as part of the discussion here. And then we'll pull it all together at the end with a bit of a summary. So just in terms of the origins of time and motion study. So, oops. Hi, Al. So the origins of time and motion study stem back to scientific management. So from Frederick Taylor back in 1911, so been around quite a while. The idea is that it comes from manufacturing, but this concept of being able to take an individual's work and analyze it in what he calls a scientific method. He wanted to determine what the most efficient method of undertaking a job would be. So his concept was there's only one best way of doing something, therefore I'm going to work that out, and then I'm going to control my employees using an adherence to that process. So the most suitable person is doing the job scientifically. In order to be first class at doing the job, everyone had that ability as long as they were following those processes. And that very much this idea of management versus workers, and the management's role was to ensure that the worker trains and does things in a first class environment. Management plan, supervise, workers carry out. It's a very old-fashioned view of the world, but it's that concept of, within scientific management, we sort of pick up around, can we forensically look at how people are working? Are there ways of improving how they work and understanding what, if we were to look at 4 or 5 people doing the same thing, are there ways of improving the efficiency as we go through? So that's the origins of scientific management, time and motion study. So one of the things we want to do is, right, how do we apply this to policing and fire? So effectively what it was, time and motion study, you might have seen people walking through manufacturing, so factories with a stopwatch and a clipboard. How many widgets can we make? What was the impact of standardizing processes? So those ideas of, can I time any process that we're doing, and can I do it faster or make sure that it's done in the most efficient way? So from this point of view, very much parallels with the Industrial Revolution. And what sort of came out of this was this idea of SOPs, or standard operating procedures. If we can do things in a standard way, how do we make sure that we are being as productive as possible? And productivity sounds like almost a nasty word just now, but it's that idea of, if we can get through the work and do it properly, but as fast as possible, means that you can be more productive or get through a greater workload. Very much from a manufacturing point of view. So then there's a question of, how do we apply it to our organizations? So the idea of time motion study is the fact we're going to put the process under a microscope and then understand what that means. So I'll sort of try to put together sort of 5 challenges we see with time and motion study. The first of which is shadowing, and the fact that it is a highly resource intensive practice. So one example of shadowing, or how you can do this time and motion study, might be some work I've done recently. I'm working with a fire control room, and they've said, actually, the best way of you understanding our processes isn't necessarily with the data. Why don't you come and sit for a day in the fire control room? If you do get the chance to do that, I'd encourage anyone to do it. It's hugely beneficial to understand not only the processes that are taking place, but the challenges and the pressures that the call handlers are under. In my day or my shift that I spent with them, it gave me a great breadth of what was going on and gave me an understanding of how things operate on a day-to-day basis. But I did one shift. In fact, I didn't do a whole shift. I did 8.5 hours or so not a whole shift. But even throughout that whole shift, I would hear things like, oh yeah, it's like this just now, but it's different on nights. Or actually, today's quite a quiet day. You should have been here yesterday when everything was going off. Just wait till peak demand comes in. Or, as we've heard in police control rooms, what happens if your control rooms are split across 2 or 3 different estates? Oh, it's different here. We'll hear that when we do neighbourhood policing. Certainly doing the neighbourhood policing work up in Cleveland. Middlesbrough is going to be different to Stockton, which is different again to Redcar. So if we were to go in there and just shadow and understand what neighbourhood officers were doing, or fire prevention officers, a lot of the time that's going to be resource intensive, trying to understand what's going on. So in any project or any piece of work we're looking at, you do end up in that balance. It's a lot of time to invest to understand these processes. And the more time you invest, the greater the breadth of experience you get. But you're never going to see it all. The one thing I would say, though, that time where you're seeing, certainly from a consultant point of view, and I know that a lot of you are, as analysts, are working as effectively internal consultants, the fact that you're spending time in the room speaking to the contact operators or the neighbourhood officers, by doing that, you certainly get in a position where they buy in, say, oh, they're doing a review, but they're actually listening to us, and they're hearing some of the gems or the nuggets of information that are going through. So that first one is, yes, it's really useful to understand the processes, but that concept of shadowing, it is resource intensive. It's resource intensive, and then there's always a question of, is it representative? If I go and do one shift, am I seeing the true picture? Sometimes it might be the fact that what I've been shown in that are particular issues. Oh, Ali, come and have a look at this. This is interesting. Yeah, but it might be interesting. It might only happen once a month. There's that question of, is the squeaky wheel getting attention? Do we shout about some things that happen, but actually they only happen very seldom? And then there's also that piece of when we start to do activity analysis, I'm always concerned not about who responds, but also the areas that we don't have responses for. So certainly when we do the neighbourhood policing activity analysis, generally we get about 60% response rate. That means that there's about 40% of officers who haven't filled in their forms. Is there a reason that they've not filled in the forms? Is there a reason why they didn't want to respond? These could be the people who have the most to tell us, the most insight. So there's that question of, yes, we might be able to get a nice split across, take Cleveland, for example, across the 4 local policing areas. We might get good representation or good split, but there's still going to be 30, 40% of officers out there who didn't respond that might have something very interesting to say. So there's that question there of, is my sample size representative? Some of you may have heard of the Hawthorne effect. There's this phenomenon that behaviour changes by the mere fact that things are being observed. To put that into context, if I go and sit in a force control room and I sit next to a dispatcher, within the first 5 minutes, they're probably going to change their behaviour. They're going to notice that I'm sat looking over their shoulders, and they're going to behave differently. Now, generally, when I've done this in the past, after about 45 minutes or so, people start to relax and go back to their normal behaviour and do what they were normally going to do. But there is this concept that if you know that someone's watching you, or someone's timing you or doing things, you might actually do things differently. So, for example, taking one of the processes from earlier, the force crime management piece, you might be looking at that and saying, well, generally that takes 2 hours to do. Oh, but if Ali's here and watching me, I get it done in an hour, or it gets done in 45 minutes. It's very different to what would normally happen. Is it normal? Is it different because someone's been cracking the whip, or is it because actually they're watching and you have that Hawthorne effect working? Fourth challenge is that how long is a piece of string? And certainly when we run workshops, we commonly get that piece of the response. When we say things like, how long does it take to investigate a burglary? The response is generally, oh, that's too difficult to quantify. It could be anything. It could be 3 hours. It could be 9 hours. It all depends. It all depends. So generally, when we get that response, we've done something wrong. We want to try and break things down into their constituent parts. Each of these components that make up the larger activity. So taking a burglary investigation, for example, yes, there might be big variation depending on certain circumstances. But what if we started off and said, right, how long does it take to get to, what are the things we need to do? How long does it take to get to the scene? Generally, that's somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes. How long is the initial investigation? How long is the scene of crimes? And you start to list out all these activities. Suddenly, what looked like very airy-fairy numbers, you're able to put an idea of that in there. And from that, we're able to understand things around variation and context. And when we talk about differences, variation and context become really important. Typically, if you're doing workshops or you're talking to people about activities, they're going to remember the really short ones, and they're definitely going to remember the really long pieces. Ask a response officer, how long's an average scene guard that you're on? Do you know what? They'll probably forget the 45-minute one and the hour one. But you see that scene guard I was on 4 weeks ago, where I was there for 10 hours. At that point, you start to remember. Are all scene guards 10 hours? Probably not. But there's then that question of not just hindsight bias, but remembering the ones that were most griefy or most traumatic in there. But very much trying to understand not only what those variations are, but how often they occur. There's always a case as well that when we're doing this workload analysis or trying to understand that activity is, can we understand the variation? And if not, if things are significantly different, is it worth creating a new work stream? Or should we accommodate things within the current view? So if, for example, in a vetting project, we say generally it takes 3 hours to vet someone, unless they have, and you start listing out 4 or 5 different outlier pieces, that could be 15 hours. I don't really want to take an average between 3 and 15 hours. What I would rather do is do the 3 hours piece and then understand why something might take 15 hours. You start to potentially create another work stream just to understand the difficulties in there, or the differences we see. The fifth challenge is about backlogs. If you are shadowing or you're doing activity analysis, one of the things that's really difficult to gauge is what's going on under the surface. Is what you see on a day-to-day basis normal? Or are we seeing backlogs that are either static, shrinking, or growing? So one of the things there might be, you might have a vetting team, and that vetting team are working as hard as they can, but there's always more work for them. So that it looks like they're churning through work really well. But actually, when we do that activity analysis, we find out the backlog continues to increase. So rather than taking 8 weeks to do a vetting application, it's currently 10 weeks. Something that, is certainly not police and ambulance, but one of the things we hear a lot these days is the Passport Authority are taking longer and longer to process passport applications. Pretty similar piece there is, and actually people are only going to be concerned about their experience on that. There's always that question there of, if we know that there's a growth in the backlog, what's the best way to resolve that? Is pushing more resource into the area enough? Or is there something about the management piece? And certainly one of my colleagues, Rob, talks a lot about working with managers and understanding that some managers always worry about their team running out of work. So they always have things piling up. Not because they want, and it's just a management piece that they look at and say, well, actually, I always want my team to be busy on something. So I'll have these things on the back burner that I can then move in. So very, very much a difficulty that we would see in understanding and assessing backlogs there. So I think the summary of these challenges are, when you look at activity analysis, you're looking from a one person's perspective of what you see, and actually you're trying to get a much wider view of the organisation as a whole and how that's working. So a couple of things we've done in the past around trying to do to generate activity analysis. Yeah, I talked already about the fact that it's useful to do some shadowing to understand the processes. But really that's very selfish from my point of view. It helps me to understand the processes and it gives me a better understanding of the organisation. But it doesn't really give us good data to work on. So typical things we tended to do, we'll look at things like activity analysis spreadsheets. So one example of this would be the neighbourhoods example we've got here. So this is an activity analysis form we'll use for, and in this case it's Staffordshire Police, but effectively for every day, each officer would fill in their name, their rank, their warrant number, what shift they were on, and then how they were spending their time. So in this case, it's a late shift, and the person's come on, they've got internal meetings for the first hour, then spend some time reviewing briefings and incidents and crimes, some niche activity, and then some more reviewing crimes. So what's happened there is over a 2-week period, the organisation has asked each and every one of their neighbourhood colleagues, those officers, to go and effectively write down in a spreadsheet how they're spending their time. And by doing this should bring us a rich picture of neighbourhood policing across the area. So this is what was done in Cleveland. It's been done, I think we've done it with about 10 forces now. Really useful piece of work. But actually, there are limitations to that. It involves the officer themselves trying to quantify, okay, well, what did I do in the last hour? Or typically they'd fill this in at the end of a shift. Or, as we probably find out, they might start the next day and go, all right, what did I do yesterday? I've got this silly form to fill in. So they go back through and do this. And as you can see, the level of detail here, 60 minutes, 60 minutes, 60 minutes. We don't necessarily have the breakdown of actually, I was spending 50 minutes on this and 10 minutes here, and I did a bit of patrol and a bit of things. The other piece as well is that it's asking people to make a choice. And actually, we know in neighbourhood policing that sometimes if you were on patrol and you saw something and you might have an engagement with people and a public event or something, sometimes you've got more than one hat on at the time. The problem we also have with this is the fact that once the 2-week period is finished, it relies on the officer sending that to their sergeant or their inspector and then forwarding that on. So there can be a delay in getting those through. Delay before the analyst sees this then becomes problematic because in this case everything equals 60, but there's nothing to stop people double counting, and then you've got to understand actually what did they mean when they put this in. So it can be a challenge there. So the typical outputs that this would give us, so this is for one of the neighbourhood policing organisations we've worked with. How are we spending our time? So an approximation of the proportion of time. So by taking in these spreadsheets that we saw here and then aggregating them through an analytical tool, we're able to present back and say, actually, in this force, PCSOs spend almost half their time on patrol. Sergeants are spending more than half their time on problem solving and harm reduction. This sort of comparison is useful in terms of being able to understand by rank what people are doing against maybe the neighbourhood priorities. Where it gets really useful is if we start then breaking that down by geography. So for example, in Cleveland, if we were to compare the PCs in Middlesbrough against the PCs in Redcar, are they doing different things? And is that the same or different to what we'd see in Hartlepool? The questions there that we'll be able to look into on that. But by doing this activity analysis, that can help populate the analysis tools that can start posing those questions of does that feel right? Now, the bit that I've always got a concern on is the fact that people might look at this and go 44.9%. I actually want that to be 51.6. You've got to remember that this is a 2-week period. So is it a representative period of what was going on? I had one example where there was a force who found that one of their areas, their PCs, had spent huge amounts of time on supporting other departments. The problem had been that during that 2-week period where the activity analysis had taken place, they'd had an elongated scene guard that had been going on across 5 shifts. So they had a situation where 25% of their PC time was taken up supporting other departments through scene guards. That's not necessarily representative. So we then had to use this process and say, okay, we've got the analysis that we think we've got. Is it representative of what we would expect to see on a normal period? And that's where practitioner judgment and the professional judgment has to be applied. We mentioned earlier about using an app. So Rhiannon talked about the South Wales app, and that was something that I just wanted to touch on because I thought it was a really good use of technology there. The spreadsheet approach that I talked about has limitations, particularly around making sure that that data validation takes place, that we've not got more than 60 minutes in an hour, or that the hour hasn't been filled in. We don't have a way of ensuring consistent formatting or even motivating people to fill in the form. One of the problems that I know we've had in some areas is not necessarily knowing the approach and what kind of response we're going to get. The beauty of the South Wales model is when they put an app together, that app reported every night, and we were able to understand which areas have responded and who's not doing their activity analysis. And if we know who's not doing the activity analysis, we're then in a great position for management to, I've said encourage officers, but effectively task them and say, look, you've got to do this. And we did see when South Wales did theirs, South Wales Police got a response rate that's 15 points higher than any of the spreadsheet approaches I've seen historically. So there is the ability to incorporate some sort of technology in there. Now, that's not to say that the inputs that are put in are going to be perfect at all, but it does give us a way of reducing the issues or reducing the difficulties that officers would face. Final thing on that, because the app reported to the data warehouse overnight, every night, that speed of analysis was so much quicker. We didn't have to wait for and chase up 300 spreadsheets being returned. These happened far quicker. We were able to do that analysis, so speed of thought, and being able to produce those results much quicker. So I'm really keen now, because I've talked for enough time, is to understand your experiences. Having done activity analysis, are there areas where you think this sort of stuff would be useful? Have you experienced those types of challenges yourself? Anyone?
I think I can give you some from my side. Basically, everything you touched, I've experienced, especially on the variation side, and the consistency of inputting, finding a time to input those times or the specific tasks that are behind that activity. Investigations, I think, is the most complex example that I could think of at the moment, where you don't investigate continuously. You have breaks or you have interruptions in the middle. So it's like, how do you keep track of all the time you actually spend investigating something, where it could be from an hour to another case could be years, probably. And again, as you said, whether or not, where in that line do you draw the, as you say, the proportionality of, okay, this is mostly the amount of time that we dedicate into an investigation, because the extremes can be very enormous sometimes. And also finding, as I said, finding that little time and saying, okay, you have to go there at specific an estimated specific time to see the extremes. Or how do you do it? Do you get and call yourself just to step in and say, okay, fine, let's take some measurement, and then maybe it doesn't come up to be what it was expected? So sometimes you just have to wait. Someone does something at the end and then says, yes, this is what an extreme version of what task we're doing is. So yeah, it's very time consuming, the more complex the activity is, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I think you certainly touched on proportionality, representation, and then I think the one bit that I found that was when we've done those activity analysis piece, the amount of people who want to stick things in other tasks, because it wasn't on that spreadsheet, for example, there wasn't the exact wording that they wanted to put in. So it goes in as another task. And we've had some in the past. I don't think it's anyone on this call, but certainly the officers would put in something like waste of time filling in this activity analysis. I was like, all right, well, you spent 5 minutes a shift doing that. Thank you very much for it. But yeah, I think there's certainly a bit there about understanding how it's been positioned within the organisation too. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Ali, I've probably done a lot more activity analysis than I kind of originally thought, having seen that. But I did sort of quite a different approach, and I did mine through workshops, which for me was really helpful to sort of try and get people to commit to some numbers, especially if we've got sort of several people in a group. It kind of opens the floor up for discussion, and eventually people are usually happy to put an average on things. But yeah, I must have just not realised I was doing activity analysis a lot of the time, but probably didn't go quite into as much detail as you have. But yeah, mainly did mine through process maps and workshops, which yeah, did turn out quite well in the end. So that's probably a recommendation for other people, because I did get similar feedback of the moans and groans about alternative approach of doing a tracker, which, like you say, doesn't always go down very well. So if you can get the time to do workshops, that's definitely something I found beneficial.
I think your benefit there as well from your workshop is you get the qualitative data that you need to make your models, or at least the understanding of that, how many people to read, etc. But also it gives you the qualitative piece around, okay, well, what are people moaning about? How does it fit together? Are there, or someone had an idea about something, oh, that's never going to work. Why is it not going to work? And you start to understand a bit more about the organization, rather than being on that sort of surface level. You're able to drill down.
It did definitely give me a lot more context around the role and kind of why they do things the way they do, and things like IT issues, things like that crop up that you probably might not see through doing a tracker. But yeah, you get all the background context as to why people follow the process that they do. So yeah, really kind of happy with the workshop approach going forward. And I think I personally would prefer to carry on that approach. I don't think I'd personally choose trackers. But
yeah, and I suppose part of it is about what you could, sometimes it's a hybrid approach in terms of you might not be able to get that many workshops or sometimes, but then you want to try and give other people a chance to input, I suppose. But yeah, that very much depends on the approach of the organisation. Any more in terms of thoughts? Graham's got his hand up. We've got Graham.
Something that we found useful in Cleveland is being able to benchmark activities and processes against different departments. So when we did our complex exploitation team around CSE investigations, we were able to benchmark what an investigation looked like against a sort of like complex CID investigation as well, to help that validation process. So we're always looking back at a kind of previous processes from different departments that may be similar to sort of like say, does it actually feel right? And we found that quite useful.
Yeah, certainly that benchmarking of being able to do like for like processes. We've certainly found that with a couple of fire services recently. So we've been doing a bit more work in the protection prevention side of things, and actually understanding in force A, and so in service A, they're taking X amount of time to do that, and get if we see a similar or different answer from the others, what we do with that, and then revisit those activity analyses and trying to understand, are we measuring the same things? Someone said yesterday, apple and apple, are we measuring apples and apples? And if they are they different types of apples? And sort of understanding those contexts there.
Yeah. Sorry, I was a bit late, Ali. But I think there's no right answer in it. The workshop approach, you kind of get it from a very small sample size, which is what we found when we do the response models. That we were only speaking to, not even 1% of the organization really.
Yeah.
And then using the app for our neighborhood stuff. Obviously, we're able to sample over a larger set of people, but likewise, it's that professional judgment has to come in then and say, well, why is it this one area is massively different somewhere else? Yeah. And then that sort of links in quite nicely with the workshops to say, well, we do it this way because. So I don't think there's any I don't think there's a right or wrong way of doing it. I think it's horses for courses, really, isn't it?
The one thing I didn't pick up on, though, that just come through actually on your app piece was the fact that you, as an organisation, invested a lot of time and effort into the comms piece. So making sure that people understood what this was for, why it was being used, what it was going to be used for, and just trying to get the buy-in. And I think part of that's one of the reasons why you got such a high return rate, so to speak.
Yeah.
The app helped in terms of the technology and getting away from those considerations, but actually you did far more comms than certainly we've seen in maybe other organisations.
Yeah, there's a lot of comms going up to it, and obviously we had a comm strategy throughout it as well. And like you said earlier, we weren't waiting on spreadsheets to come back to be processed. We had live time. We knew instantly when someone was, creating a record or hasn't created a record. So at any given time, we could actually see, how things were going. That fed day one fed straight away into sort of SMT to do that gentle nudge and encouragement then for the following day.
Gentle,
yeah. It also, gentle being a firm gentle, but we're also able to change it live as well. So there was an obvious need. On day one, we realized other tasks were building, and there was a theme. There was an obvious gap in the app, which was building in the other tasks. So we could live change the app, and then all that data from there on was a little bit nicer. I think we went from something like 20% other tasks, people categorizing it as other. I think we sort of slashed it in half overnight.
Yeah.
But again, that was something we probably couldn't have done with Excel sheets without really upsetting the officers. Oh, by the way, that sheet we sent you, there's another version of it here. Can you use this one?
Yeah.
But no, I think both approaches have got their own merits, to be honest. The workshop approach or the activity app.
Matt, you've been sat with your hand up for a while. Sorry.
That's all right. I was just only to echo what Alan said. We've used the app as well within Gwent, and to be perfectly honest, we've done a number of activity analysis for neighbourhood response and other departments, and there are pros and cons to it. I mean, the dumping ground of sort of other tasks is always a consistent one that we found, and even we did, as an example, we did response policing a number of years ago, and we did provide 24/7 support to that as well, to make sure that they are filling in on the night shift even, because I think that's the problem that we've had with all activity analysis is after 2-3 days, no matter which department it is, sometimes that buy-in is gone as such, and then the compliance rate does drop dramatically after a few days. So having some sort of communication, ongoing and making sure that they fill it in is almost a must, really. Certainly with some of the response officers, we found that it's getting sort of after a few days in, it's keeping the interest levels up, but also as soon as they have any queries or what they're filling in on a sheet, whether it be an Excel sheet or whether it be on an app, they sort of lose that buy-in. So I think it's always consistent messaging and making sure that the powers that be are driving it from the top, really. That's always been our problem.
Thanks, appreciate that. Okay, so Ricardo, question.
Yeah, going back to what was about I think mentioning about the buy-ins and whatnot is I think what I found is, yes, 100% of the time is that the people become non-compliant and forget or are not bothered to actually fill in the information. It's either two ways. You have to really allocate resources. Either you put the existing people who are responsible and then take them aside so they can just focus on that, or you have to allocate another additional resource from somewhere else to actually do that exercise, because then eventually you won't get the data, in my experience.
I think that's the question in terms of how representative, how proportional, and how good is your data, because if you're going to start making decisions off the back of it, you need to know how good that quality is and the implications from that.
Yeah.
Okay, I had a couple more slides, which was just very much just summarizing what we had today. So yeah, we've talked a little bit about the activity analysis and its origins in scientific management. from Taylor back in 1911, which is a long time ago. 5 challenges that we sort of went into detail about, of shadowing being resource intensive, any sample size and thinking, is it going to be representative? The Hawthorne effect, which is a very an interesting way, I suppose, of saying being in the system affects the system. So as we monitor things, do we have an impact on it, which I think is useful. That piece around how long is a piece of string, and certainly people feeling uncomfortable about putting numbers on how long processes take. And then that piece of, if we just look at specific shifts, it's difficult to assess what's happening behind the scenes around backlogs, or are we getting through all the workload in there. Spreadsheets have their place, but as to could be the apps, certainly know that from the South Wales point of view, there was a significant amount of investment in comms and also the technical side of things to get that to work. And sometimes the activity analysis spreadsheet comes to the fore because it's easy, but with that, it still has its own challenges. So that was what I had today, but I'm going to stick around for a little bit if people have any questions or want to have a chat about things. I just want to say thanks very much once again for coming to the webinar. One thing from me,